Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we are very excited to welcome Dr. Chris Stephenson. She is the head of CS Education Strategy at Google, and we are so excited to have her here. And we'd like to also welcome all of you. We're really excited that you could join us this afternoon, and I know we have teachers and educators on the call from Seattle and Bellevue's in Washington. So thank you all for setting aside the time this evening to talk about computational thinking and computer science. And we are so excited that Chris is willing to join us. And as we continue our conversation and our journey, as we learn more about bringing computational thinking and integrating computer science for our kids in K-12. So again, welcome, Chris. And maybe what we'll start with is have you do a little introduction of yourself and tell us a little bit about your background and your role at Google.
Happy to. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really delighted to be speaking with you today. I've been at Google for almost 3 years, and my role is very different than from most Googlers. As you mentioned, my title is Head of CS Education Strategy, but what that really means is that I try and help people all across Google who are working in the CS education space to determine what kinds of programs are needed and valuable in this space, and what those of us on this side of the fence need to understand about students and teachers teaching the educational environment that will make our programs successful. And the one thing I really try and impress on our Google team is don't be a solution in search of a problem. Don't think you've solved some great thing in education unless you really know that it's a problem and that we can make a real contribution to fixing it. Prior to coming to Google, I spent 10 years as the founding executive director of the Computer Science Teachers Association, and my job there was to really build a community of practice that would serve and support computer science teachers right from the ground up. And I was really fortunate that I took that job while I was working on my doctorate in teaching leadership from a social justice perspective. So you can see how those two pieces of my life fit together very well and fit currently with my role at Google. I also had the opportunity while I was doing my master's degree at an institution in Toronto called OISE, the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto, that Michael Fullen, who has done amazing work on teaching leadership, was the dean. So you might say that my belief in teachers as leaders and change agents has always, really grounded the work that I do and that I care about. My responsibilities at Google are really to think about what the big, hairy challenges are and how does Google have the ability or the credibility to solve them. You may have heard about some of the work we've been doing with Gallup to better understand what's happening in the CS education space, diversity, what's happening with students, what do parents and teachers and principals think. And what was really exciting for us, one of those stand up and cheer moments, was when President Obama referenced our data in his announcement about CS for All. So we really felt like we were making a contribution to the field, and that was really important for us. Right now, I think one of the biggest gaps that I'm seeing, and it's right in the area of the work that you're doing, and that is how can children of all ages learn about CS and computational thinking concepts? I think teachers understand that there's a critical readiness factor, and they understand it better than we from industry do. And I fear at the moment we don't even know enough about how students master CSCT concepts. So this is something we're all working on and learning about together. So that's another big focus of my work right now.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. So what would you say are the concepts that you would consider critical to computational thinking?
One of the challenges whenever we talk about computational thinking is everybody wants to redefine it. And so you're always going to see kind of everything you read has certain subtle differences. But I think the common themes that come out in terms of the concepts are abstraction, algorithms and procedures, problem decomposition, something to do with data. Sometimes it's data collection and data analysis. Sometimes it's data representation, but something to do with data, modeling and simulation. And one of the things we also focus on at Google is pattern recognition, because we feel this is a really big part of the problem-solving process. And sometimes it includes parallelism, but that's a lot less common, and I think less important than the other concepts.
Great. And those are things, at least within our computational thinking course that we've been doing with our teachers here in Bellevue, we have really focused on algorithms, procedures, problem decomposition, and data, and especially that model and simulation. And we've spent quite a bit of time developing our own skills as educators in Scratch, and working towards really thinking about that modeling piece as how that connects to, say, like the next gen science standards, and how, I mean, computational thinking and modeling is called out right in the science standards. So we've been really thinking about and experimenting in our classrooms with that connection. How can we really have students model their thinking using something, computational artifact like Scratch?
And I think that's a really powerful way to approach modeling and simulation. I mean, when we think about some of the really interesting work that's being done right now in the field as a whole, we're looking at how do we model the brain? How do human beings learn? How do we model natural systems that are out there? And so I think, you know, this is such an important feature of computational thinking that I think it's really terrific that the teachers are really learning it for themselves, but also learning to apply it in their classrooms and share it with their students.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's where something like developing a computational artifact or using something like Scratch or some other way to model is really what one thing we've discovered is it's not static. So students can be really creating their model and having it evolve as their thinking evolves over time, which I think is a different way for teachers, at least I think in the K-8 space, how we can really capture what kids know. And so as they develop their models and make changes to it, sure, they're writing code to do that, but it's a way for their thinking to be represented in a really fluid way rather than a static way versus, you know, when we used to just write an essay, which essays are great, but, you know, there's the writing piece, or then we move to say, let's show a PowerPoint to show your cumulative thinking. But now we're really moving towards what does this look like to use something that's not static, it's much more fluid, to really engage in kids' thinking and for us as teachers to observe that over time.
And I also think, you know, it's a bit of an iterative process, but I also think that it shows kids that when we create these kinds of artifacts, that our thinking on them evolves, and that not only is our thinking evolving, but our artifacts evolve as our knowledge changes or as our understanding of what users need changes. So it kind of nicely encapsulates the whole model of modeling, which is really impactful in the classroom, I think.
Yeah, another one that you mentioned that I feel like we've been spending a lot of time on really, and I would love your feedback and thoughts on this, is this idea of problem decomposition, and especially starting with really young kids on, you know, using a lot of everyday examples and how we teach decomposition, help point that out in other subject areas or you know, throughout our day. So we're really trying to take a look at that within math. And of course, all of these concepts you listed can be applied to mathematics, but that's another area I feel like, at least in the elementary realm, we've really been able to identify with and see how we have some real cross-curricular connections is in that idea of decomposition.
And I think, you know, one of the reasons we promote computational thinking for students is not just its connection to the discipline of computer science, but its use across all disciplines. And when you think about it for a minute, especially with regard to early mathematics, and, you know, I don't know if teachers are still using a lot of word puzzles and, you know, those kinds of questions, but I think for a lot of kids that ability to kind of determine from a posed problem what the elements of that problem are and what you need to kind of call out and how to solve some of them and then recombine them for an answer, I think is a critical challenge in mathematics. And I can think of the same thing in language learning. Look at the deconstruction of a sentence and how we look at grammar and how students learn to use grammatical forms of language. In some ways, just kind of trying to figure that out is a deconstructive process. And I think, every opportunity that we give children across disciplines to do that kind of problem analysis, problem decomposition, and then the later step of, solving the small problems and then putting them together in a larger problem is I think a way to really ground the concept in lots of different realities and disciplines that the students see and lots of experiences that they have.
Yeah, great, thank you. So on that, what computational thinking concepts do you think are most challenging for students to grasp, and why?
Surprisingly, for me, from what I've seen, is the answer is data. All of whatever we're doing with data. It's not that the idea of data is hard for students to grasp, or that they don't understand the concept of collecting data on things. I just think the field of data science and big data, which we're moving towards as we go up through the grades, it's just really challenging for teachers to get a handle on how to teach it. I was at a conference all this weekend with folks from all across industries and lots of different organizations, and we were talking about the role of big data and what it plays even in our own decision making. And I just think it's a little bit challenging to find the right level at which to provide this and share this information with students. And I think it's more of a teachability issue, but I think, when I see a lot of work that teachers are doing, I feel like that they're really solving it in really interesting ways. But just, I think, even if you go up to the level of the computer science principles exam that has a big, data piece of it, I think teachers are finding a little bit challenging to figure out what the heck they're supposed to do there. And it will evolve over time, but I just think right now it's kind of new to everyone, and we're all kind of working together to figure it out.
It's interesting you say that. One of the things that occurred to me this weekend when I was signing up for Apple Music, and it asks you different preferences. Do you like this or do you like this? Or do you, you touch on the screen and it makes a visual representation of what your likes are, what your stronger preferences are. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, this is all about data, right? And how, and I was thinking they're helping kids, even starting at a young age, understand some kind of basic, I don't know how to quite describe it, like data literacy, right? So they can understand that how so many things you do all day long, even as a child or a student, are all about your data. If you get on Dreambox and you're using this, this responsive math program, it's looking at your responses and charting your path in a very particular way. So I think, just like you said, it's a challenging concept to teach, but I also wonder, how we can start talking about it almost from a data literacy standpoint with kids, and how data is represented in so many different ways.
Yeah, and I think that's a really helpful approach. And I think, we're all, as human beings, we're data collecting machines. We make all of our decisions based on data, which may be conscious or unconscious. And I think helping students understand that everything that you take in a way, is a form of data. That, if you can make that connection for them, I think it can be really helpful. Mm-hmm. And I also think, depending on the age level, as we get to grade 6 to grade 8, it's really easy, I think, to teach the concept of, the integrity and the privacy of our own data and that of others as well. And I really think it's important to start addressing those kinds of concepts as early as you think the students are ready for them, because it provides, thinking about their own data, I think provides them with a certain amount of protection that's important, kind of, basic cyber behavior. But I also think that it begins to help them understand that we're also making ethical decisions all the time with regard to data, not only our own data, but data we may collect from other people or from other situations. So I really think it's important to start as early as you think your students are ready for it, having that conversation with them as well.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So we talked a little bit in the first question about opportunities and challenges in teaching computational thinking in an integrated way. But what do you see as the special opportunities and challenges in teaching in an integrated way with really young children.
I really feel like educators at the elementary level, so K-8, they are our experts here. They are so much more comfortable teaching in an integrated fashion and making those connections to kids. And, back in the Stone Age, even, when I was in elementary school, I remember we would do, a unit on something, and it would involve all kinds of multiple disciplines, although I didn't think about it at the time. That's just the way it was taught. And it made any kind of situation we were focusing on come much more to life for me, because it really was taught in an integrated way. We study Mayan civilization, you look at art and culture and agriculture and science. I think when teachers get to high school, though, the high school environment is much more specialized. That's where we're not teaching science anymore. We're teaching biology and chemistry. So we start, breaking down into the unique disciplines. But, I think the fact that we're starting to talk about and introduce computational thinking in K-8 is going to make our students much more aware of interdisciplinary opportunities. And when you think about what's really driving innovation these days in our society, it's those people who I think of as context travelers. They take something over here that they learn, and suddenly they apply it, over here, and that's where the space of innovation occurs. And the better we can prepare our students to be those kind of contextual travelers, I think the more powerful their ability to innovate is going to be. Look at the fields now that never existed even 5 years ago: computational biology, computational or data journalism. I mean, not just the sciences, but also the humanities. So I really love the fact that we've got a group of teachers who are better prepared to teach in an integrated fashion when the kids are really forming their ideas about everything in the world around them and their own interests. And I know that there are lots of secondary teachers who are very good at teaching in an integrated manner, but it just feels like the environment in K-8 is just more ready, more able to facilitate that kind of learning.
Mm-hmm. I think that's something we're just through the course, and just with the folks that were in our computational thinking course, and I think the folks in Seattle are really starting just to explore what does that look like, and how do we integrate, say, even like robotics, simple robotics, or encoding into, say, a science lesson or a science within the science unit, so that kids can have multiple ways to experience computer science. And like you said, when they enter the world after college, I mean, they're thinking about the disciplines and the integrated nature of what they'll be doing is to start early, and we're really trying to figure it out. So what, thinking about kids as problem solvers, what strategies do you use to help kids see themselves as problem solvers, and going beyond that stereotype, helping kids go beyond the stereotype?
I had the opportunity a few years ago to participate in a computational thinking workshop that was sponsored by the National Science Foundation and was a partnership between CSTA and ISTE. And at that event, I met Joyce Mallon-Smith from EDC in Boston. And I have to say, for me, it was one of those moments that just completely turned my head around. Joyce talked about dispositions, even more than concepts, about the kind of learners we could help students be through computational thinking. And for me, that was so incredibly powerful, because that's the kind of thing they'll carry into the rest of their lives. And once again, when I was at this conference this weekend, and we were talking about, what do we see as really necessary skills for students, or current skills gaps, some of these things came up time and time again, which I think starting early with computational thinking will help us address. And so, Joyce defined these dispositions in a variety of ways. Confidence in dealing with complexity. One teacher this weekend said to me, where I get frustrated with my students is they want me to give them the 5 steps to the solution and then the solution too, rather than thinking through the complexity for themselves. And then persistence in, dealing with difficult or open-ended problems, that, continuing to chew away at something. The ability to handle ambiguity. When we think about, we talk about that a lot here at Google, that our designers, our engineers need to be able to come up with solutions even when they don't have all the clear information. They have to figure out a way to deal with that ambiguity. Being able to work with others and achieve a common goal or solution. Again, this is something, this is a core 21st century skill. And I think computational thinking really helps them do that in students. And then one that's kind of not talked about as much, but I think is equally important, is knowing one's own strengths and weaknesses. And this goes back to collaboration and teamwork. If we're working in a group to try and solve a challenging problem, you may be the queen of mathematical formulas, and I may understand how to use software, and our skills can be complementary, and together we can create the solution. So I think all of those, helping kids not only practice those and learn those strategies, but to be conscious that they are developing those abilities, I think is a really important piece of helping children see themselves as problem solvers, beyond just, I'm writing a piece of software, I'm creating an artifact, I'm learning to be a thinking, functioning human being in a complex world. And they may not quite be ready for that message at 9, but if we find age-appropriate ways to share that with them, I think they're just going to be so much better prepared for the world they'll be learning and working in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up. One connection that might be some of our teachers on the call might be thinking about is we're actually in a lot of our elementary schools really taking a look at how do we create student-centered classrooms where we're fostering independent learners, not dependent learners. And all of those descriptors that you just gave us really point to ways, really specific things to think about as we help students become independent learners and thinkers. And that our role is really there as the facilitator. And I think that's what's fundamentally that shift, especially for K-8 educators, as we start to teach computer science and computational thinking, and really changing our role from being the deliverer of information to being a facilitator of creativity in some sense, and really helping kids work through problems and giving them some strategies to do so, but all the while really keeping that at the forefront. We want them to be independent learners and be able to exhibit some of the confidence and persistence and being able to handle ambiguity. So thank you. I really appreciate that.
One of the things I wanted to mention is at this conference this weekend, I had the opportunity to have lunch with some amazing people who, some people might know Mitch Resnick from the Scratch team, and Milton Chan, who was the editor of Edutopia. And, one of the things that we somehow just organically got around to is that every one of us has a teacher to thank for where we are now. And the stories were different, but all the same. And it was always about not my teacher taught me mathematics or my teacher taught me how to write a sentence, but my teacher taught me how to love math or love language, and my teacher taught me how to think for myself. Mm-hmm. And I think exactly the kind of skills and the kind of effort that you're putting towards that independent learning ability, I think is so key. And I think, most of us get to a point in our lives where we realize that without those abilities, our lives would have been very different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really true. So shifting topics just a little bit, I appreciate you sharing information and conversations that you had at your last conference that you went to. What other resources would you recommend, or things that you think would be helpful for us as educators on this pursuit of really learning more about computational thinking and also adding to our toolkit as educators?
A couple things I would suggest right off the bat, if you've got, and I'm sure your teachers know this right from the heart, which is that if there are standards that you have in your state, they're always the first place to go. Looking at national standards like the CSCA standards and the code.org K-12 framework is a really nice way, especially for the grade bands, you know, because they're broken down by grade bands, to look at suggestions as to how to implement certain concepts at what stage of development. I personally love CS Unplugged, and I know your folks have been doing some work on it. There's Tim Bell, who developed it in New Zealand, is working on a new version with more CT content. And one of the reasons I just love it is because it recognizes that, you know, children are not little automatons that are comfortable sitting behind a desk all day long. Most of us are not. Mm-hmm. And the fact that it, you know, he builds in kinesthetic learning and activity and working as a group. I just think it's just such a great resource for teachers, and I'm really excited to see the next version that Tim brings out. And I just love the fact that it's free and available to anyone who can use it. Resources are tight in education, as they have always been, and free is good, especially free and good quality is extra good. You know, and I think that giving kids lots of practice with problem solving, you know, is really, really a key. And this is not just for K-8. You know, when we interview future software engineers at Google, the ones who don't get hired are the ones that have difficulty breaking down a problem and then clearly articulating the logic of their solution. And it's, you know, sometimes there is a perception that engineers don't have to communicate their ideas effectively, but that's critically important because we're all working in teams. So I think having that opportunity to not just to come up with a solution, but to articulate it and to some extent to defend your logic, I think is a really important resource that teachers can give students through their teaching and their practice. I recently had the opportunity to review a new textbook on computational thinking for teachers that's in the publication stage right now. And I have to tell you, when the request came for me to review it, I didn't immediately jump for joy, because sometimes this stuff can be pretty awful. But I started and read one chapter and I was completely hooked. You know, this chapter was on the collection of computation and maze and labyrinth patterns. And it was seamlessly melding in ancient civilizations and mythology and storytelling and mathematics and computational thinking. And I was entranced. I could not put the chapter down. And I felt like this is the kind of modeling we've been talking about in terms of how to teach it, but I haven't seen anybody actually kind of pull it all together in one place. So the book isn't out yet, but I will be happy to share information with you so that you can share it with your teachers when it comes out. So it's definitely something to look forward to.
Great, thank you.
And I also think, I mean, there's a lot of resources in computational thinking on the website now, on the web, available on the web now. Some are more useful for teachers than others, and you just kind of have to apply your own perspective on them. And if you're really interested in modeling and simulation, Wolfram Alpha has some really interesting biological modeling simulations that might be appropriate for kids in grades 6 to 8. So that's another resource that kind of just quickly comes to mind that I've seen used really effectively for slightly older students in terms of computational thinking, especially in the sciences.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Those are some really good resources, and we'll look forward to hearing about that, the book, the textbook, when it's released. That's really exciting. So we've spent a lot of time on the Bellevue side, and the educators that have been in the computational thinking course. We've really been focused a lot on equity and access in computer science, and really specifically thinking about our biases, our inherent biases that we all have them, but how we might bring that into teaching CS and computational thinking, or CS more specifically, or technology. And one of the things that we want to, the reason we've spent a lot of time on that is really thinking about what are our inherent biases, particularly around for girls and students of color, and how do we address those? And I'm just curious what, some thoughts you have on that topic.
Oh, I think the biggest bias that we have to confront, and we hear this from teachers and from students and from parents, and the data that we've done to find out what opinions are around this issue really confirm our worst fears. And that has to do with this belief that you're either born with the CS gene or you're not. You're either good at it or you're not. And this misconception just leads us to all kinds of problems and preconceived notions about who is and who isn't and who will be and who won't be. And none of them are really grounded in fact. I mean, this we know. And the manifestations of this bias can be subtle and insidious. And we can, as teachers, present this bias without even being conscious about it, just in the language we use with our students, or even about ourselves. In trying to comfort a student, saying, I had, math is hard. I had trouble with math too. And we can get those kinds of things built into how we talk to our students about what they're doing. And I know that you told me earlier that your group has done, some work around Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset and how it helps us break down these kind of biases. And, essentially we say our roles as educators to help students understand and believe they can become good at CT and CS, and that the way to do this is through effort and not, original ability. And we can find ourselves saying things like, wow, you must be really good at this. You've done something really well. Or, but instead we can say, wow, you must have worked really hard to get such a good result. And so there are subtle ways that we can tweak our language to kind of avoid this kind of innate pitfall that sometimes we fall into. And it's often surprising. I'll tell you, the people who I hear express this bias the most consistently are university computer science professors. Like their kids are either good at it or they're not, and if they're good at it, they'll do fine, and if they're not, they won't. And I think that that's a way of disowning our responsibility as educators, and saying, it doesn't matter what we teach them, they're either going to get it or they're not. No, the way that we teach them and the way that we encourage them to feel engaged is what's going to ultimately impact how well they understand this information that we're trying to share with them. So I feel like, that whole learning versus ability is a big pit that we can fall into sometimes, and we have to, as a large community in education, we kind of have to climb our way out of it. And I'd say, elementary teachers are the first ones to help us, get up that ladder, and the secondary teachers are following them up, and I think the university people are still standing in the hole and trying to find the ladder. So I think that there's, we have to keep working on that as a community.
Okay, great. Thank you. So along that, you mentioned as teachers too, that language we use, and especially as most of us are learning computer science and computational thinking, as many of us had other majors or other things that we were studying as teachers in undergraduate school, but at that messaging around even how we project our own learning to kids is important. And my understanding is that you don't have a background in computer science, but what would your message be to other teachers who are starting to teach computer science?
I just grew up from, as soon as I could, I think, had a sense of identity, all I wanted to do was become a teacher. I carried around a briefcase as a child, in which I decided I had all my learning and materials for my class. So I had a real path laid out for myself. And unfortunately, when I graduated with my English literature degree and I wanted to teach English, there were no jobs for teachers. I'm at the end of the baby boom, and they were closing schools behind me, and they were laying off teachers with 10 years of experience. So instead, I started my career as a journalist. And although that has served me well, it kind of had nothing to do with computer science at the time. And I was an artsy. That was my self-identification, and computing was not on my radar at all. But my infatuation with computing came about because I got asked to take a job as a technical writer when personal computers were first becoming available, and they desperately needed someone to translate between the engineering speak of the software developers and the actual users. And so I fell in love with computing because it was a means to an end. It was a way of communicating with a whole new audience, and I really, really valued that. And I think that as educators, we're all driven by the desire to prepare students for the future. And if you're teaching CS or CT, you're giving your students critical skills. And you don't need to be an expert. You can learn along with your students. You maybe need to stay one step ahead of them, but the power of modeling to them that as an adult, you are still open to learning, you are still learning, and that you can proceed from learning to mastery, I think is really powerful for the students to see. It's hard as a teacher sometimes to feel like you don't have all the requisite knowledge that a student may require of you in a given moment. But the truth is, your students, as they mature, will never have the access to all the information they need in a given moment. They'll have to learn how to get it. And you can master that process, and you can model that process to them as you work with them to master things. So, my thing is, don't be afraid to be afraid. Don't be afraid to be vulnerable, but be out there and model learning together. And that's because that's what we're all going to have to do going forward.
Right. Great. Thank you. That's a good word of inspiration and encouragement for us as we are on this journey and all learning together. And certainly as we're, like you said, being transparent in front of our kids with our own learning for many of us. So as we bring to a close our time, I just wanted to, and one thing I had asked you is about some resources or things you would like to share with us. And I know that Google has some great resources and information. And I have asked someone to put the links in the chat window that our participants see. But I think what I'll try and do is share my screen here, and then we can take a look at, I'll start with, know if that's actually, is that?
Wow, that's kind of scary.
I know, that doesn't look quite right. Okay, that is, maybe let's stop that screen sharing. Did it? Yeah, there was something not quite right there. Okay, so I think what we'll do is, hold on just a second. Maybe I can also send these as a follow-up to people, but if you could describe a little bit about the computer science education research that Google is doing and some of the reports and a little bit about that work, so that when we send the link to people, then they can look at that. Because I know personally for me, I found it really helpful, especially reading some of the reports, and one is actually the unconscious bias in the classroom, evidence and opportunities, but they're really great evidence-based reports that I think educators should know about. So if you could tell us a little bit about those, that would be great.
Sure. People may not know that, we've been doing a lot of research in the CS education space for the last few years, and part of it was, we started doing it to try and figure out for ourselves what we should be doing, and then we realized that this, that really accurate scientific data about the state of computing education in schools was not broadly available. So we began working on this one set of research resources with the Gallup company. And they helped us really create a very broad public opinion kind of set of data around what is actually happening in schools. And there's a whole page of CS education research that are related to a lot of different topics, like, as you mentioned, unconscious bias in schools. But there's a series of reports that, you know, that are kind of the overarching reports on what's happening with CS in schools. And then it really, there's smaller reports that kind of drill down into what's going on with specific communities. So, you know, what's the situation with regard to the engagement of girls and access to computing for girls, the Hispanic population, the Black African American population. And so there's like a whole lot of detailed data that is scientifically valued. It's not just made up numbers. And it will, I think it really helps educators both advocate for computer science education, but it also helps them understand some kind of wacky things that seem to be happening. The most startling result, and I think it just hit all of us right in the forehead, is that 91% of parents want their children to learn this content in schools. That surprised us, and that's across all ethnicities, races, income levels, and in fact, lower income parents are more inclined to think that this knowledge is important to their children. However, administrators consistently listed this as not a big concern for their parents or communities. And so there was this huge gap between what the parents wanted and what the administrators thought the parents wanted. I think maybe that has to do with the agency that parents feel in terms of, you know, wanting things for their kids in schools, especially lower income parents. But, you know, it's a nice way of, you know, pointing out to administrators in our schools, like principals, that you may not think this is important, but I'm not the only one who thinks this is important. The parents think this is important as well. So there's lots of that kind of data and information available in this research page that you're going to share with them. A couple of other resources that might be really helpful are, there is a Google Exploring Computational Thinking repository that has over 130 lesson plans that are aligned to standards in 5 different countries, including the US. It's really complete lesson plans, all on a template that are very high quality, and teachers can just access the repository and download anything useful to them. And then some folks may know about our CS First for middle school content, a series of modules where students, you know, step through a learning process. It's all online, it's all free. Originally, that material was developed to be used in club-like settings, but we woke up one day and discovered that 35% of our users were classroom teachers, completely unbeknownst to us, because teachers are feisty and they're going to find what they need no matter what you decide it's going to be used for. So, you know, clearly teachers are finding that content useful and are able to incorporate that into their classroom as well. And you know, some of the other materials are, you know, there's a Blockly Games that's a little set of 10 online programming games that step students through at various levels. So there's lots of resources out there, and there's a general, Google has a CS computer science education website that if they do a little bit of digging, it's not as hard as it used to be to actually find useful things.
Great, thank you so much. And I'll follow up with information about all those in the link specifically. But that's always really helpful. You're right, we are a feisty bunch and we're always looking for good resources, especially in this space, because we're trying to learn and bring in some new things into our classrooms and on this amazing pursuit. So we appreciate those resources, and we really appreciate what Google has done. I know as a CS leader, I've used a lot of the resources and different things over my time learning this role. So I don't think we actually are able to see what folks have if they're posting things, but so I think we'll bring our time to a close here. But Chris, thank you so much for joining us. This was so, your expertise and your input and your deep knowledge about computer science, computational thinking, and education have just been it's just been a valuable time spent. So we really appreciate you joining us and saying yes to my my invitation to join us. I know that this is our first year doing this kind of work and really wanting to learn from people across the spectrum in CS education. So we really value your time and appreciate your contribution.
Thank you so much. It's really been an honor and a pleasure, and I wish you all the best. The work you're doing is very important, and you've got great leadership and great energy, and I know you're doing terrific things.
Great. Well, thank you.
Thanks so much.